Hey there, it's Jack Curran, and I'm a black and white landscape photographer, and this is one of the videos that I'll be producing for my YouTube channel. Sorry it's been a while. I've been traveling quite a bit and doing some workshops and some other things. So I hope everybody's healthy and safe. I know there's probably a few more people that are spending some time at home, so I want to make sure that I can get some videos out and give you guys something to do while you're thinking about everything that's going on in the world. Again, I'm in my office here. I've got the artwork and the photography that's behind me is artwork that I collect. So this is in my office, and I have like Henji Kutanjaro from Indonesia, William Neal, Clyde Butcher, Cole Thompson, John Wimberly, Bob Kohlbrenner, Huntington Witherall, just a lot of photographers that I collect, and I would encourage people to collect prints for their walls. I mean, it is really the best way to express what we do. So I hope you guys will all do that. So I had a question about showing a little bit more work around waterfalls and water in general. So I've pulled up a couple of different waterfalls. You'll see here that I've got waterfalls here. So we're going to go through that, and we're going to talk a little bit about waterfalls. I'll take you through some post-processing techniques on maybe one or two, and just kind of give you some flavor for some waterfalls and how I work with water. And I might even show you a little bit different technique on ways that you might approach them differently than the way I do. We'll talk a little bit about emotion, the connective tissue, tension, how things are feeling from a mood perspective. We'll talk about light, creating transitions, flow. It's really important to think about flow, the elements of design with lines and your graphic elements, especially when you're doing water and they're flowing over rocks and stuff. And so I'll get into that in a little bit, but just wanted to take some time and let's dive in. All right? Okay, so here we go. I'm going to pull up real quickly. I'm going to hit the N key, and which is going to allow us to look at different things. I'm going to hit the tab key, get rid of the palettes on the side, and then I'm going to hit the L key real quickly. And what you can see is a variety of different waterfalls here and or subtle, I don't know that I'd call these little cascades as well. But so when we look at waterfalls and think about how we want to approach those, at least from my perspective, I'm really interested in trying to capture the essence of what this water is trying to do. You'll notice in the lower right, I have these bridal veils that are kind of cascading down. Well, that's at a 250th of a second. These ones up here are probably at 20-30 seconds. There's some that are probably in the 1/8 or 1/6 of a second range, and then there's some up here from Iceland that might be in the minute to 2 minute range. And each one captures a little bit different emotive response, and I'm thinking about the connectivity to the scene. Like the Iceland one has this long transitions of water in the foreground. The cascades here, just the detail is to show how they go over the rocks, and down this one is the intimacy of a close-up and how the one rock is splashing off the top of the other and in between the others, and it's a little bit different story. And then there's the bridal veil ones that have a bigger, more powerful story, especially when they land on this ice cone from Lower Yosemite or Upper Yosemite Falls onto the landing pad here. So you'll see that I treat these things all a little bit differently. So let's just pick one. Let's go into the Yosemite one. I'm gonna get my palettes back. I'm gonna hit this. Get my development tools up here. Oops. All right, so when I first look at this, I'm looking for the flow, and you'll notice that I see, some texture in the rocks over here, a little wispy bit of water coming down. There's a stream here, but there's not much really going on. And then the really interesting thing is this cone. There's some texture down here and some light, and there's this tree or bush here that was kind of in my way, but I really like the composition. So when I'm shooting it, I kind of have the vision of what I'm going to do, which is really pull the the bridal veil out, keep it concentrated in the eye. So I'm going to take the things around it dark. The hard part is holding detail in the snow and the ice and that cone there, and then trying to pull back and find the texture that is in the rock wall on either side. Now I could probably pull out more detail here, maybe a little bit more detail down here, and we'll go in and we'll take another look and see how the approach that I'm going to try now is a little bit different than maybe my first attempt. So I want to go back and take a quick look at this. We're going to go into the develop module. I'm going to go down here, and I'm just going to quickly key in on the remove chromatic aberrations and lens corrective. You can see it just kind of opened up the perspective just a little bit. I do that just because I think and it especially works sometimes with helping with a little bit of the vignette that may be inherent in a lens. So I want to look at some of the colors that are affecting. I would have thought that the yellow moved a little bit more. Maybe it's up in here where it's moving a little bit more. And you can see that you can manipulate this a little bit. And if I wanted to go into that, I'm working in the luminance right now, not necessarily the saturation. If I go to saturation, I can start really moving the colors back and forth. And if I want to do that a little bit later on, I can once I convert it to black and white. I am going to just brighten that up just a little bit. There's a little blue in the water. You can see right here in this area that when I manipulate the water, it adds a little contrast in there and brings out a little definition in there. So there's not much going in magenta. There might be a little bit here in the orange. I really don't see much. So there's not a lot going on as far as what I can do with the HSL and the color. So everything else is pretty neutral. I'm going to go ahead and do a conversion to black and white. And as I say a lot of times, I really don't want people to go to presets. I like them to go through the process of converting a file by itself. One thing I see here right away is that the exposure is just a little bright. And if I take the exposure down and I look at it, I'm seeing all the detail that's down here. I'm seeing how this becomes isolated up here. Now watch when I take the highlights up. You can start to see how the cone starts to pop, but it still hasn't a lot of texture. All right, but by moving those things back and forth, you can pretty much see how you can manage and control the final image to some extent. Now I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to take the highlights way down, and I'm going to start looking at if I lower the contrast and I really flatten this thing out, I can see all the detail in the subtle shades down here. Well, I may or may not want that. Sometimes texture in things like this can look muddy and dirty, and you want to be careful to avoid that. So let me just quickly go up here and just zero these back out. I guess I could just hit reset and convert to black and white. Might be a little quicker. All right, so I'm gonna take the exposure down a little bit because I want to pull that overall density down. Then I'm going to pull the highlights down just a little because I'm gonna work this in layers, and I'm going to bring those highlights back up, and I may go in with a brush and just highlight certain parts and try and create flow in there as well. Let's take a big radial, and you'll saw in my first one what I'm really going to try and do here is just take all the corners down first so that the eye focuses in on this. And I'm going to go ahead and click the invert, double click effect to reset all the tools. And then I'm going to kind of bring the eye down like this. Now you can see I'm going to dramatically move this just so you can see what's going on. So my exposure is way down right now, and you can see how it changes the whole mood and intensity of the image completely. So I'll go ahead and take this down a little bit. I want to hold some of the detail back in here. I'm going to go back and pull some of this back out. And then I'm going to take a second radial filter. And because I have these highlights in here, I might offset this a little bit. Double click effect to reset it. And then I'm going to go the other way. And I'm going to add a little contrast. I don't want to lose too much of the detail in the highlights. I'm going to take a little look at, I'm going to move the texture, and you can see the texture hitting right here in the rocks as well. I don't think we're ready for that yet. So I just want to see what happens if I just start pumping the highlights in there. It's hitting the top of the cone. And so what I might do is take a brush here real quick. Oops, excuse me. I'm going to go here and here. I'm going to do the brush here, and I'm going to hit the erase tool. I'm going to go back here and just erase some of that cone back in. Okay, if you want to see what I did here, we'll hit the mask. We can go down here and we can just kind of clean up a little bit around here. I can make this a little smaller. Just go in there and touch the top. Make sure you have the auto mask on here, because if it finds a good edge delineation, it will do a lot of the homework for you, and you don't have to go in and do as much detail work. Okay, I'm going to turn that off real quick. So now I've got this kind of in a decent place, but I want to go down and look at the water here. I'm sorry. I want to look at the snow. I'm going to call it a snow cone. I'm going to double click effect to reset this. And I'm just going to open up the exposure so it's a little brighter. I'm going to hit the contrast a little so that the shadows down in here show up a little bit more. You see it's affecting down here as well. So I might go back and erase that and pull that detail back out in a minute. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little clarity and a little texture in there. And now I'm going to close this real quick, and I want to look at the overall clarity. See how I'm just going to dramatically move this for a minute, and you can see it gets way too contrasty when you do this. But if you add a little bit, or we might even go back and do it selectively, I'm going to go back and I'm going to pull down some of these sides just a little. And I really think that the snow down here is still too muddy and very gray, and it looks dirty. So I'm going to go back to my original radial filter, and I'm just going to pump the whites a little and the highlights. I'll brighten that up. I can make this a little smaller. I'm going to move it over to the left side, and then I'm going to do another one, and I'm going to overlap for this right side and kind of do the same thing. Double click effect, highlights. You can see how that's brightening up over there a little bit now. I don't know that the white's going to help me. Now I can also take a big brush. I'm going to feather this probably about 50-60%. Auto mask is on. My flow is at about 60. I'm going to take that down a little. I'll go about 50-50. And then I'm just going to kind of paint over. I'm going to double click effect. And let me turn this mask on for a second here so I can show you what I'm doing. So I'm just kind of painting over the white. I'm not really terribly worried about any of the... And you can see I'm leaving some areas a little bit less. I'm going to turn that off. Now I'm going to go in on that brush and I'm going to open up just those exposures. So now I'm a little bit more even overall. I'm still holding some detail in here. And I may just go back and just peek at the texture. It's not doing a lot. I don't think I need a lot more in texture. Okay, let's go back up here and let's hit another radial filter. And what I want to do now is I want to pull out the detail over here in this rock. So first I'm going to just take a peek at it with the highlights. And then once I go in a little bit of exposure, but once I go into clarity, it's going to take the midtones and it's going to start separating that. You see how that pops that midtone over there? I'm going to take a brush, and we have this little stream of white coming down here. I don't know if it's going to be distracting yet or if it's going to be needs to be enhanced even farther. So double click effect. I'm going to open up my exposure, a little highlight, and just a touch of white. I'm going to keep that all the same. I've got a kind of a medium-sized brush in there. And I'm going to start kind of painting into that area where it's kind of coming down. Now, I'm actually thinking that this is distracting, so I'm going to get rid of this. But I am going to go down here and pull out some more of the detail down here. So I have just a little bit more of the water coming down here maybe up through here, popping some of these bridal veils a little bit more. I'll hit a new one and I'll reset this and just see what happens if I just paint over this a little bit, hit this a little, and just kind of touch some of those. I'm going to do one more new brush. I'm going to double click effect, and this time I'm going to take the highlights down and the whites down, and I'm going to go in and try and knock that down just a little, maybe take the exposure down so it's just not quite as distracting. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here. There was some nice detail that I didn't really hold in the first version of this. I'm going to double click effect. I'm going to open up shadows, and you can see it starting to come out in there. I'm going to pop the highlights in the shadows and see what I have for the white in the shadows. Now that's giving me some nice tone in there. Might even do this just a little. Now I can separate that even more by hitting the clarity brush, and you see how the highlights and the midtones separate a little bit. I don't want it to be too much. I'm going to take a brush now, double click effect. I'm going to open up my exposure. I'm going to open up the shadows. I hit highlights just a little, and I want to see what happens if I start kind of painting down in here. There was some kind of interesting rocks down here. I let them go fairly dark before. Now I'll go back and just adjust the exposure a little bit so I have a little bit more of those rocks. Okay, that's starting to look pretty nice. I think this one highlight right here is a little distracting, only because there's a big shadow right here. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back with a brush, and I'm going to go ahead and double click effect and reset that. I'm going to take my exposure down, my highlights down, my whites down, and try to knock this down a little bit. You can see how it's slowly but surely getting a little darker. And I just want to take that down so it's not quite as distracting. Now there's some things down here that I think are fairly distracting, and that bush that we mentioned in the beginning is still there and a little bit distracting as well. So I can do this with a brush again. I can go new, double click effect, exposure, highlights, whites, make it a little bigger, start painting some of this down just a little bit, and start pulling that down. Now I can knock it down a lot with just exposure. And go ahead and hit some of these highlights a little bit more. All right. I can also go up here to a radial, just kind of go across the area like this, rotate it, double click effect to reset it, and then just try and pull the highlights down this way as well. And it should just minimally affect the highlights. There's still a few more in there that are just a little intense. Pull those down, knock them down. Now we'll take a quick peek here. I'm going to go up to the histogram and I'm going to hit this. And you can see some of my D-Max is really kind of blown out. A great way to fix that is to go up to the brush tool, double click effect, take your black, open it just a little, and maybe your shadow a little, and then go in and start painting some of this stuff to your minimum D-Max detail back in, right? So while I knock the highlights down, this is really going in and just affecting back into the black areas that were pretty dark before. Again, you can go back and forth. You can actually leave that black pretty dense if you want. But if you want to pull just a subtle detail back, that's something that you can manipulate in your final print and really decide whether the detail is busy or getting in the way of the image. Now I'm going to show you the two images here, and what you're going to see is one that has a lot of black around it. Let me just hit this real quick with the compare, and then I'm going to go turn the lights out for a second, and you can see the two images. This one is a little bit more dramatic. I really like the water in here. I have a little more detail down here. I have the ledge here, and I think that helps. This highlight over here helps a little bit more. I have this shadow now that kind of leads into the frame instead of all of the other stuff. I've also kind of minimized the shadows over here to keep the eye in the frame. I notice the highlights here are still here with this water, but I kind of like the fact that I took that and did that and knocked it down a little bit. So you can see they're quite different. But, they have different intents. One is a little bit moodier than the other. One is a little bit more open in the shadows, bringing out that texture in the rocks. So let me do one more thing here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a virtual copy of this last one that we did. Actually, I'm going to use another image real quick. I'm going to go to this image right here, which was out in Oregon. And so what I want to do is, by the way, I hiked for 3 miles in snow without snowshoes. It was a little too early in the season, but I ended up getting up here and having a great time. So I was the only one up there too. I'm just going to knock that little piece of dirt out. So when I look at this image, I'm also looking at this and saying, okay, maybe there's another way to approach something like this. You'll see here when I look at it real quick, I'll do a quick compare and turn the lights out. And I've got a little bit different crop. But I'm also saying, I like this. It's really moody, it's really intense, but I want to try something a little different on this one. So let me get the toolbars back up and everything and just share something else. I'm going to go back in the develop module. I'm going to turn this to black and white. And here's the great thing about an image like this. A lot of times when you shoot color, with the exception of some very subtle greens or a little warmth in the wood, it's already black and white. So it's almost like the easy button. I'm already in that place where mostly what I have to do is convert to black and white, control the contrast, and I'm 95% there. But for this one, I want to try something a little different. I want to go a different direction. I want to open this up. And I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to crop it, something like this. And I'm going to really kind of try for a bit more of a high key look. I'm going to bring a little bit of the black back. But I think there's something about this that's really kind of cool. I can manage a lot of this with the clarity as well. Or I can go and look at the texture. You see what's going on with the rocks there? Sometimes going a completely different direction with something, take that density down just a little bit more and keeping it fairly high key. And then I might even come over here to the rocks, create a big radial here, turn it, and then just go in and open shadows and blacks and exposure. Now you can see this is pretty blown out in here. If I hit this, you're going to see that it's very blown out. And again, I can take a brush. I can take the exposure down a little. I can take the whites down. And I can paint a lot of this detail back in. So I will probably do that at the very end. And then you can always just do that. Move the slider. Paint, 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 paint. Get some of the detail back in. All right. So, but it's a completely different feel for a waterfall. All right, let's go back. Let me close this real quick. And I just want to, I'm not liking the texture for this thing, or the clarity really. Although, you could bring in an element of black in, and you might just go in and do something. Well, let me go back. I'm going to open this up. I'm going to close this. I'm just going to open it a little bit more. Close that off real quick. I can fix those later. But I might want to go back here and take the highlights up. Or I'm sorry, we want to take the black up and kind of knock it out of there so it's very subtle. We do the same with the shadows. Do it again down here. Black is up. Shadows is up. Now you could pick something in this frame. I'm going to do it up here too because I've got the same kind of dynamic going on there. And now I'm kind of opening the whole thing up. But you could go back later and pick something in the frame, like these two rocks in the middle, and look at it here and just start to bring the black out in just those rocks. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. I actually like it much more open like this, and it feels pretty good. And then I would go back and fix this. So when you think about, when you look at that, how much different that is than this, it's like two totally different waterfalls at two totally different moods. And that's what I was saying at the beginning of the video, that I think you can go back and you can look at things and try to realize what you're doing at the time of your exposure, what your intent is. You know, William Neal does a lot of great high key work, and this would be something that I could see William doing and doing very, very well. Whoops, let's go back here, tab. I'm going to quickly go back to this one. Let's see here. That's the one we were working on. What I want to do real quick is I'm going to do a virtual copy. I'm going to reset it. Let's see here. Develop, reset, and I'm going to pull all three up for you so that you can kind of see. Let's hit the N key. Now we have all three. This is the original one that I did. This is the one in the middle, and this is the original file. Now I'm going to go back to this one, and I'm seeing something here that I would change pretty quickly. I still think the snow looks kind of dirty in there, so I'm going to go back with a brush. I'm going to double click effect. Let me turn this off real quick. And I'm just going to do highlights with a touch of white. And I'm just going to kind of brush in some of these areas right in here that are kind of gray. I'm going to change and vary the size here. You'll be able to see this when I kind of go back and turn on some of this. And I'm not really concerned about going too much over the auto mask, and I'm only really moving the highlights and the whites, so it won't affect it very much in the shadows. And then I can go in and I can open this up just a little bit, and it's just a little bit brighter. Do the same thing in here. Maybe swipe over this once with a little bit bigger brush, and just kind of spot check this in little areas to kind of open it up. All right, so that's a pretty good take on a waterfall. As you can see, I quickly went in and showed how to do a high key one. But you know, I hope this helps, and I hope that answers that question on the person who wanted the waterfalls. Thanks. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.